Jasmine, did you know that it's the most important week of the year? This week is the most important week of the church year. Lots of children think that the most important week of the year is when Jesus was born at Christmas time. But you need to know that the most important week of the year is the last week of Jesus' life, when we remember all those things that happened that led to the beginning of the Christian faith. I want to tell you some things. I want to tell you first what happened on Palm Sunday. Jesus had been a friend to a small group of people. He'd loved them, he'd healed other people, he'd taught them, he'd told them wonderful stories. But one week, when all of the Jewish people were coming to Jerusalem to share Passover, he came to Jerusalem with his friends, the 12 disciples, and there were crowds going up to Jerusalem. And when he arrived there, do you know what he did? This is what he did. Can you see Jesus on a donkey?
Yeah.
Jesus had said to his friends, let's go to Jerusalem. And when he got there, he asked one of his friends to find a donkey. And Jesus clambered onto this donkey, and they threw cloaks on the road, and people picked up palm branches and they waved palm branches, and this small group of people shouted, "Hooray! Hooray! Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And there was a crowd that were behind him, supporting him. And as he came into Jerusalem, as people were saying hooray, there were others who were a bit jealous, and they were the religious people, because they weren't sure that they liked what Jesus was doing. Jesus was turning their religion upside down. They had rules about who was loved and who was unloved, who was clean and who was unclean. And Jesus said, everyone is loved by God. And so the religious people, you know what? They wanted him dead. But there was this crowd of people who thought he was wonderful, and that was his inner group of friends. As he came to Jerusalem, there was so much noise. There was so much noise, and everyone was really, really happy. And Jesus even was laughing too, perhaps. And when there was so much noise, some people said, well, tell the crowds to be quiet. And Jesus said, no, even the stones would cry out if the people were silent. And so Jesus came to Jerusalem, and he was there in Jerusalem, and this was actually going to be the last week of his life. And do you know what? I think he knew that. I think he knew. In fact, deep down, I know he knew. He told his friends that he was going to suffer and he was going to die for them, because he knew that what he was doing was going to be such a challenge to the religious people that they were going to want him dead. But still he carried on. I think it was on the Monday, the day after that, although it's hard to tell from the Bible, but I think it was on the Monday that he went to the temple, and he didn't like what he saw. He didn't like the way religious people were behaving, because when people came to the temple, they brought animals with them, and they were going to offer these animals as sort of sacrifices. They believed that if they burnt these animals and their prayers went up to God, that actually God would bless them, that they would give something of the best of what they had got, and in return God would love them more. And they would come with their animals from far away, and they would come with their money that they used in their own communities. And when they got to the temple, they had to take out of their pockets the money they had, and they had to exchange it for temple money, which apparently those shekels were clean. But Jesus didn't like that behaviour. And as he went into the temple, he saw this table with the pigeons and the lambs and the goats, and he saw the money changers there, and he got hold of the table. Can you imagine this, with all the money on, and he went whoosh! Can you imagine the noise as all the money went onto the floor? And he looked at the religious people and he said, you've made my house into a den of thieves, but actually this, my temple, should be a house of prayer. And very quickly the religious people decided that they'd got to get rid of him. And they had to work out how to do that. Jesus was in the temple, and he was in the precincts, in the outer area of the temple, and he told stories. Some of the stories he told made the religious people realise that actually they weren't being very kind to one another. And more, all of them began to believe, we've got to get rid of him, we've got to get rid of him. There were thousands of people came to Jerusalem for Passover because do you know what Passover was? It was when the people gathered to remember how long ago, in the days of Moses, how they had crossed over from being slaves to freedom in a promised land, and how they'd celebrated that with a meal, a celebration meal that they still celebrate, how they remember that they live as free people now. And they would each year at Passover time come to Jerusalem if they were lucky enough to be able to afford to go, and they would have a meal with their friends. They would have some lamb. That would remind them of the blood that was shed all those years ago and the blood that was put on the doorposts. They would have maybe a boiled egg to remember the new life. They would have some bitter herbs to remember the pain of slavery. And they would have some salt water to dip the bitter herbs in to remind them of the tears they shed. And they would break bread together and they would drink wine and they would celebrate. And Jesus was in Jerusalem to remember all of those things. Jesus told his friends later that week, after he'd taught them and healed them and loved them in the temple precincts, he asked his friends to go and find a room where he could have Passover with his 12 friends. And that's what he did. It was to be a special meal, an important meal, where they'd all sit down to eat together. But Jesus had a heavy heart that night. He felt sad, I'm sure, because he had a sense that this was it. This was going to be the end. Jesus' friends were probably a bit surprised about that as they gathered around the table and they had the lamb and they had the loaf of bread and they had wine. And Jesus looked at his friends around the table, the 12 friends. They travelled with him. And he looked at them and he said to them, do you know, one of you is going to betray me. Can you imagine his friends around the table? Actually, the table was probably a cloth on the floor. They would have probably been the 13 of them, the 12 friends, Jesus, and maybe some women serving them around the edge. And Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. They would have all been fearful then. They would have wondered, who's it going to be? And each one said, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? I wouldn't do that. Jesus said, yes, one of you will. One of you with whom I dip this bread in the cup is going to betray me. Now, one of his friends, Judas, had perhaps, we don't really know, but perhaps he'd begun to lose patience with Jesus. Perhaps he wasn't the Messiah that he'd expected. Jesus had come to Jerusalem on a donkey, a humble and meek donkey. Jesus hadn't been the sort of Messiah. Perhaps he wanted a sort of warrior king. And Judas perhaps was getting a bit fed up with him. And Judas had already been to the authorities, and it's hard to believe this, but in return for 30 pieces of silver, Judas promised the authorities that he would betray Jesus. Around the table, they were all scared. Jesus told them that he had to leave them. They didn't understand where he was going. He told them he was going to a place that they couldn't come to. But that he had to leave them. He must have had such a heavy heart. It's hard to get inside all the feelings around the table that night. But Jesus then told Judas to go and do what he needed to do. Now, you can't imagine what his friends thought at that point, because Judas was the one that was like the church treasurer. He's the one that looked after the money. Perhaps they thought Judas had been sent to go out of the door and buy some more bread. But Judas went off into the night, and it was dark. In the Bible, dark is sinfulness, unkindness, nastiness. And we're told in the Bible that it was night, it was dark when Judas went out. And after he'd gone, Jesus picked up the bread and he broke it, and he said to his friends around the table, when I'm gone, every time you eat a loaf of bread, remember me. The don't suppose he meant go to church. I imagine he meant every time you sit down the table at home, every time you eat your bread together, just remember how Jesus lived and try and live in that kind and loving and forgiving way like he did. And then Jesus took up the glass of wine, the cup of wine. I don't know what it was. Do you think it was pottery? Don't suppose it was glass in those days. He picked up the pot of wine, the cup, and he said to them, this is going to be for you like my blood. And every time you drink it, just think about me. When supper was ended, they went to a place to pray. Jesus and his friends, they went to a place that we call Gethsemane. And it's an olive grove. You can go there today, and there's still olive trees that have been there for 2,000 years on the side of the hill there. And Jesus went with his closest circle. Peter, James and John went with him, and he took them to pray, and he knelt down to pray there. And do you know what his friends did? No. They kept falling asleep. Friends aren't always loyal, are they? Sometimes friends let you down. And Jesus' three friends just kept falling asleep, and Jesus was saying to them, can't you just stay awake just for this hour? Gethsemane was a quiet olive grove. And I imagine Jesus was trying to work out and think about the pain that lay ahead, and wrestling perhaps with whether he would do God's will or not, whether he could. And he prayed to Jesus, to God. Jesus prayed to God, and he said, do you know, if it's possible, just take this cup of suffering from me. But there was a silence in the garden that night, and suddenly into that garden came soldiers with clubs and swords, and they charged towards Jesus, and Judas was with them, and they came to arrest Jesus. And he looked at them. He said to them, you didn't need to arrest me like this. I was always there in the temple. Day after day I was in the temple, and you didn't arrest me then. And Judas came up to Jesus, and you know what he did? Yeah. He kissed him like a friend. But it was a kiss of betrayal. Because by that kiss, the authorities knew which man to arrest. And Peter wanted to get his sword out, but Jesus said, put it away, there's to be no fighting on my behalf. He wanted us to remember that the way to live like Jesus is to live in peace with one another. And so they bound Jesus and they took him away. Do you know what his friends did at that point? They ran away. These were his friends. They just ran away into the dark night. They didn't want to get arrested too, because they imagined that if the authorities had come to arrest Jesus, and if they were Jesus' friends, then they might get arrested and they might get harmed too. So they ran away, but Peter wanted to know what would happen next, and he had just that little bit more courage in his heart, and he followed them. He followed them into a courtyard. Over and over again, people heard his voice, and they challenged Peter, and they said to him, Peter, you sound like a Galilean. You sound like somebody who was with Jesus. This kept happening. And Peter was denying it. He said, I didn't know the man. I had nothing to do with him. He wasn't my friend. Now, earlier on in the evening, Jesus had said to Peter and his friends, do you know this? Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And after Jesus had said, after Peter had 3 times denied Jesus, the cock crowed. And Peter felt really guilty, and he broke down and he wept. through the night there were trials. The religious people and the governor, the Roman ruler, they all tried to accuse Jesus, but there was nothing really that he'd done wrong. "You're the Messiah. You say you're the Messiah," they said to him. And Jesus shrugged and said, "If you say so." You know, in Jesus' day, if people had done something wrong, they couldn't just put them in prison. The Romans had a way of getting rid of people who were really naughty. It was cheap, much cheaper than keeping someone in prison. They made crosses and they lined them up along the road to Jerusalem, and anyone who was really bad and didn't keep the law was nailed up to a cross to die. It was a cruel and it was a very, very painful death. After the end of these trials through the night, they dressed Jesus up in a robe and they put a crown of thorns on his head. And they led him through the streets of Jerusalem carrying a cross, the cross he would die on. There was a man called Simon of Cyrene, and he was coming in from the country, and the cross was heavy. And he helped Jesus for a while as he carried it down those winding streets of Jerusalem. I imagine they were busy, people buying and selling and just getting on with their lives. These things happened all the time. Yet Jesus was an innocent man. He didn't have to be crucified. Pilate had earlier asked the crowds if this is what they wanted. Every year he had the ability, we're told, to release for them somebody who was due to be crucified, but who could avoid that if the crowd said that he could be released. And so when the crowds were asked whether he should be crucified or another man called Barabbas, all the crowds had shouted that he should be released, Barabbas. That Pilate should release Barabbas, and he'd asked what the crowd wanted to be done with Jesus, and they'd all shouted, "Crucify him." So as he walked through those streets of Jerusalem with that heavy cross, and as Simon started to help and carry it, people were watching who had loved him, who had walked with him, who had waved those palm branches and been there on that Palm Sunday, as we call it. But now they watched in guilt and horror and shame and fear, perhaps, as he was led out to die. And he was placed on a hill. We call it Calvary or Golgotha. He was put on this hill on a cross. And he was placed between two thieves. And we can only imagine what happened around the foot of the cross. People were watching. We're told there were the women, Mary, his mother, and other women were there watching, and some of his friends, I bet they felt guilty. And they put Jesus up on the cross. And it was a long and painful death. One of those who was on the other side of him on a cross, one of those who we call robbers or bandits, who was dying with him on the other two crosses, said, "Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, remember me." Jesus said to him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Another story tells that round the foot of the cross, Jesus' mother Mary was there. You can only imagine what the mother felt to see her son die on a cross. John's Gospel tells us that Jesus spoke from the cross, and he said a few things, but one of the things apparently he said was to his mother, "Mother, this is your son," pointing to his close friend John, and to John he said, "This is your mother." Around the cross, Jesus made, if you like, a new family of people who would love one another. Lots of people in the crowd shouted at him. They said things like, "You said you could save people. Come on down off the cross. Come on down and save yourself." And Jesus just looked at them and said, "Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing." The stories in the Bible tell us that after he died, the sky turned black. Do you remember? It was like night. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, who was, we're told, a very rich man, had a tomb. And we are told that he asked to take the body of Jesus and wrap it and put it in his tomb and give him a decent burial. In those days, you were always murdered or buried outside the city wall if you were a wrongdoer. But Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus' broken body and wrapped it and put it in a tomb. But it was late on the Friday evening, and we call that Good Friday in the church. Not good because he was murdered, but because out of his death comes our understanding that God loves us so much, that God would even give everything for us, even life. But on that Friday, Shabbat or Sabbath, it's the evening. Sabbath in the Jewish faith begins at dusk, when it goes dark. And so Joseph and perhaps the women helped. They put Jesus in the tomb and they sealed it with a big stone. And the following day was also Sabbath until the evening, the dusk of Saturday evening. So they couldn't come back and give him a proper burial, properly anoint his body with spices until the Sunday morning. So the tomb was sealed and Jesus' broken, dead body was placed there. I wonder how his friends felt now. They must have been heartbroken. They must have felt guilty. And I think they must have felt that was the end of the story. But it wasn't. And we're going to hear more of that when we remember Easter Day. You have a look.